Howdy musicians, welcome back. So if you've been learning songs for a little while now, and you've gotten on the internet at all and tried to look up how to learn any particular song, you've probably run across something called a sus chord. So what the heck does sus mean? In the musical instance, it means that we're going to play a suspended chord. Sus is short for suspended. So what a suspended chord is, the reason we call it suspended is because one of the notes in the chord is held over or suspended from the chord right before it. So when we have a chord change, we leave one of the notes the same when we change to the other chord, and that one note staying the same while everything else around it changes gives it a pretty cool, unique feel. Now, I'm sure you've heard this in dozens of songs. If you've listened to acoustic pop music at all, you've heard hundreds of these because they're all over the place. And these can either be used in their suspended form, meaning we have a note that's held over to create this suspended chord, or a lot of times you'll just see these used as color chords, meaning we're not doing the suspension thing, we're just using a suspended chord because they sound cool. So now, what the heck is a suspended chord? Well, it turns out there are actually two common types of suspensions. We have a sus2 and we have a sus4. Now, the 2 and the 4 refer to whichever note we're holding over. So we actually kind of have to go back a little bit and look at the chord before what we just played to know how this suspension works. So let's dive into both of these types and figure out what the heck to do with suspension chords. Alright, so to get started on this topic, let's actually begin by just hearing these. In order to hear how the suspension works, rather than doing the math and looking at the actual theory notes yet, let's take a listen to what a suspended chord does to the music, why we call it a suspension and not some other type of chord. So let's look at a particular chord change going from one chord to another and listen to how this suspension makes the sound a little bit different. So let's go from an A to a D suspended second. A, and then the suspension. Did you hear something towards the end there when I added that next note? That's the cool thing about suspensions. When we actually use them as a suspension and not as a color chord, we get this cool lift when it goes into the next chord. We hold this E note, in this case, over from our A chord into the D chord, and then we raise that E to the F sharp, and it has this delayed resolution that sounds really cool. Like that. But again, there are two kinds of suspended chords. That example is a suspended second. We also have a suspended fourth, and that's what this sounds like. Let's go from a G to a D suspended fourth and then resolve it. So we have G, and then D suspended fourth. See, again, we have that resolution coming down from that note that we suspended. And that resolution is what makes the suspension sound so cool. So now that we have a rough idea of what a suspension sounds like, let's talk about the actual notes that go into a suspended chord so you can know how to play these. Let's go with the suspended second first. So we're going to start with this A chord. The three notes that make up an A chord are A, C sharp, and E. That's our root, third, and fifth. A, C sharp, and E. Okay? What we're going to do in order to get the suspension is when we go to our D chord, we're going to hold that E note. We're going to keep the fifth of this A chord, and we're going to keep that note the same throughout this chord progression. So we're going to go from this A chord, A, C sharp, and E, into this D chord, which would normally be D, F sharp, and A. But we're actually going to play D, E, and A. We're going to suspend this E over into this chord and not let it become that F sharp just yet. So that bottom string, the E, that's going to be our suspended second. We call it a suspended second because in this particular case, we don't have a root, third, and fifth. We have a root, second, and fifth. And that's what makes this a suspended second chord. We have a second in this chord that ordinarily wouldn't be there. It's there because we suspended it from the chord before. So going from A, C sharp, and E to D, E, and A. Now, since we've hit this D chord, we can resolve that E up to the F sharp if we want to. In the guitar world, we just do what's called a hammer-on, and we just add that finger to that string. But you can use suspensions on any instrument, obviously. So we're going from D, E, and A to D, F sharp, and A to resolve it. Hey guys, real quick, if you're new around here, welcome to Music Theory for Musicians. This is what we do here. We talk about music theory concepts and principles in a way that's easy to understand that you can use to play music with other people. If you like what we do here, feel free to click the like button below and subscribe so you don't miss any of the videos coming out in the future. Now let's dive back in. Now let's look at the other example. Let's do the suspended fourth chord. So let's come from a G chord. So now we're going to go over to this D chord and we're going to suspend whatever the 4 of the D chord would be. So in this particular case, we have a G chord made up of G's, B's, and D's. And then we're going to go to a D chord, which again should be D, F sharp, and A. But what we're going to do is we're not going to let that F sharp become an F sharp yet. We're actually going to hold one of these notes from the G chord over into this D chord. So we have our G, which is G, B, and D. And now, instead of that F sharp, we're going to just use that G that's held over from the G chord. And then, if we want to, we can resolve that G down to an F sharp. So instead of D, F sharp, and A like we would normally have, we have D, G, and A. We don't have a root 3rd and 5th in this D chord. We have a root 4th and 5th. Which is why we call this a D suspended 4th. The 4th of this chord has been suspended from the chord before it. And again, we can choose to resolve it down to that F sharp if we want. So the way these suspensions are going to work is one of the notes is held over into the next chord, right? But which one? If we're coming from a 5 to a 1, doing a 5 to 1 progression, in this case we've been using the key of D, so if we went from an A chord to a D chord, then we're going to hold the 5th of the 5 chord. So this 5 chord, our A, we're going to hold the 5th of that chord over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is this E note. By the way, if you're not familiar with how to build major chords from a root 3rd and 5th, check out the video that we did on major chords recently. So if we take this A, C sharp, and E, this A chord, it's the 5th of that A chord, or the E, that actually gets held over. And that's what gives us our suspended 2nd chord. We call it a 2 because that's the current chord we're on. It's the 2 of a D chord. And that's why it's a sus2 chord. So let's look at the other example now. If we're doing a 4 to 1 progression, again in the key of D, that's going to be a G to D. This one's way easier. It's actually just the root of the previous chord that gets held over. But we call it a sus4 because when we actually get to the D chord, the one that's going to be the sus chord, that note is now a 4th of our D. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's why we call it a sus4 chord, but it's just the root of the previous chord in this case. Now I know between all of this 4 to 1 and 5 to 1 and suspended 2nd and 4th and all of this, that it can get a little bit complex and overwhelming. So if you want to look more into this, check out our Patreon page. There I've got 2 PDFs for you to download when you join. One is going to be a cheat sheet formula for how to make these suspended chords, both the suspended 2nd and the 4th. And then the other one is going to be a complete list of every suspended chord that you can make in our musical universe. All of the suspended 2nd chords, one for every key, and all of the suspended 4th chords, one for every key. That way you can just use it as a reference and you can see how all of this works as you're planning these. Writing songs, arranging things, jamming with your band, practicing at home, whatever it is. So go check out our Patreon page and download both of those PDFs. Now let's dive back in. Now notice that I said we can choose to resolve the chord or not. We can actually take this D suspended 2nd coming from the A chord, and I can either resolve that E up to the F sharp, or I can choose just to let it hang out on that E note. And it has this kind of cool floating unresolved tension that just hangs there. And that's kind of cool. So we can do the same thing with that suspended fourth chord as well. If we have a G, G, B, and D going to our D, F sharp, and A, I can choose to resolve that down to the F sharp, or I can just let it hang there. And that one has a slightly different kind of unresolved feel. That one's a little clashier, and we may not choose to do that, but you could if you wanted to. So that's basically how a suspension works, but a lot of times you'll see sus chords, either the sus2 or the sus4, without the preceding chord. You might see a song start on a sus chord. How does that work? If there wasn't a chord before it to suspend, how can we start on a suspended chord? Well, a lot of people, especially in the pop world, will use suspended chords just because of the color or the flavor that they impart upon the music, and has nothing to do with an actual suspension. And that's totally cool as long as it sounds good. So a lot of times you'll see people just play a D suspended second. Because they like the way that particular chord sounds. Or maybe you'll hear a suspended fourth creating some kind of tension before you go into something else. And it's not necessarily resolving that tension, it's just going to a whole new location. So it's still not acting as a suspension, but we can still use sus chords wherever we want to, as long as it sounds cool. In the song at the very beginning of this video, all of those chords I played on guitar were sus chords. So we had a sus2, and then I had a G sus2, going back to the A sus2, back to the G sus2, resolving, or not resolving rather, on a D sus2. And sometimes you'll hear people using this resolution without actually having any other chords involved. They just use this suspension trick to create tension and resolve it, create tension and resolve it. A real common example of that is just going from a major chord to the sus4 back to the major. In that particular case, I'm just going from a G major, G, B, and D, to a G sus4, G, C, and D. And I'm just using that 4 to 3 resolution to create a cool progression, even though no chords are really changing. So when you get into chords and harmony a little bit, one thing that you'll realize is that not everybody is playing all of the notes at the same time. Maybe the guitar player is just playing root, third, and fifth, but maybe the keyboards have a 7 or something going on over there. Or maybe the bass player is just holding down the root, but somebody else is playing an entirely different chord, which creates this cool contrast. We can actually use this with sus chords as well. A lot of times, the actual suspension that you might hear in the music is only happening, let's say, in the melody. So the chords going on below the song don't actually move, they don't actually do anything at all. It's just a regular 4-to-1 progression or a regular 5-to-1 progression. Nothing fancy going on, but maybe the melody holds over one extra note and then resolves. And the melody is then providing the suspension and making this a sus2 or making it a sus4 chord. Let's look at how that works. If I just move from this A chord to this D chord, but I sing the melody of this E note resolving to this F sharp, I can actually just use regular chords and the melody will do the suspension thing that we've been talking about. So if I go from A, I can actually do that same suspension thing just in the melody. The chord chord, regular old D chord, but I still got the suspension flavor in there just from the melody. And then here's an example of the same thing with the sus4 chord. If I go from this G to a D, I don't actually have to do this resolution with the chords, I can just do it with the melody. So just with the regular chords. So we actually still get the same feeling or the resolution of this suspension, but the chords are staying the same. It's just in the melody. So more important than the actual remembering of a sus2 chord or a sus4 chord is the idea of a suspension. Because we can suspend a lot of different notes. It's not always just the 2 or the 4. Usually when we do it with another note, we call the chord by a different name for theory reasons. But the suspension idea can really be done with a lot of notes. One thing that you see all the time in Southern gospel music with harmonized singers is they'll actually do this suspension of a 6th note, going from a D chord to an A chord, something like that. They may suspend this, which is actually going to end up being the 6th note of this A chord. That's a really common thing to hear in 4-part harmonies, is to have somebody resolve the 6th down to the 5th. Alright, now let's talk about a way that you can practice these suspended chords to get better at them and start using them in your music. The most obvious way would be just to try every suspended chord out there, right? But we want to practice it in the context of how the suspension actually works. So just pick any random chord and try the suspended 2nd and the suspended 4th. Okay? Now, these are going to be usable all over the place because they're coming from a 4 chord or a 5 chord. And the 3 most common chords that we have in any song on the planet, 1, 4, and 5. So you can use these just about anywhere. So let's just take any key. Let's say the key of G. So we're going to do a G suspended 2nd and a G suspended 4th. Let's do the 2nd. So we're going to be coming from a D chord. Remember, our suspended 2nd comes from our 5. So if we're going to go from the 5, this is going to be a D chord in the key of G. That's our 5. And I'm going to be going from this D to a G suspended 2nd. And that's going to resolve to just a regular G. So we have D to a G suspended 2nd, resolving to a G. D, G suspended 2nd, G. Okay, now let's do the G suspended 4th. So this is going to be coming from our 4 chord back to the 1. So we're going to go from C, which is the 4 in the key of G, and then I'm going to go to a G suspended 4th, which is going to resolve to a regular G. Well, thanks for watching today. I hope you learned something. Don't forget to check out my Patreon page where you can join and download 2 PDFs to go along with this video. One is going to be a sus chord formula cheat sheet that shows you how to make any of these sus chords. And then the other one is an entire list of all of the sus chords that we can play in the musical universe, both the sus2 chords and the sus4 chords. If you have any questions or you want to see me cover something specific in a video, drop a comment down below. Practice hard and we'll see you guys in the next one.